I don't know, I've been part of their group for over 10 plus years, I think. So that's how we've gotten to know them. So they pre-exist or predate the Tucson Civil War group by quite a bit. Okay, we're going to go straight to and have Barbara go ahead and do her presentation. So I'll introduce her in a minute, but mainly so if she or the Saddlebrook people want to leave and after her presentation, whatever, and not hear any business discussions we have, they're welcome to do that. So we're going to go ahead and let Barbara go ahead, and I'll just begin by introducing her. Hopefully you've read the newsletter that gives her background, but Barbara is a lifelong educator, professor, and since she's also a Civil War buff, historian, probably a buff extraordinary, more than just the regular buff. She's at the next step up, the next level. And beyond that, and maybe more impressively, she's I'm not sure what the correct term is, but there must be some term for something like a master seamstress. And she will be in character and in costume today in a dress that she made herself among several other dresses. So, and her discussion is Elizabeth Van Lew, Union Spymaster in Richmond. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn off my video and my audio and
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I am Elizabeth Van Lew, the Union Spymaster in Richmond, here today to share with you my life story. I'll open by giving you some background information regarding conditions in Richmond. Then I'll delve a little into my personal life, explaining the role my home played in my espionage activities, as well as my involvement with some Libby prison breakouts, the Ulrich Dahlgren affair, and the Underground Railroad. I'll close by discussing my professional life as the Union Spymaster in Richmond. I'll explain exactly what a spymaster is and the role that I played. I'll give you some insights in some of the tradecraft I employed. You'll learn the difference between tactical and strategic intelligence. I'll close with my post-war activities. To begin, in the late 1850s, Virginia could claim just under 5,000 manufacturing establishments, ranking it 5th in the nation in this particular category. But they were, of course, far behind the industrial North. We were primarily a tobacco growing state. At that time, Richmond was becoming a political hub and a leader in manufacturing and commerce. Its growth and modernization were powered by slave labor. By 1840, nearly half of Richmond's population was African American, both free and slave. Richmond's merchants exported tobacco. Its flour milling firms dominated trade with South America. And the Tredegar Iron Works produced railroad iron and ordnance for a national market. Canal boats and railroads carried grains, hides, tobacco, wood, iron, and coal from the interior to Richmond, where finished goods could be shipped worldwide. Railroads greatly accelerated the economic development and diversification. Actually, Richmond had 5 railroads running through it, and the city's population quickly tripled by 1863, and most of these were war refugees. By the beginning of the war, Richmond was of vital importance to the state of Virginia and its war efforts. It was the chief inland port for ocean-going ships. Besides being the political home of the Confederacy, Richmond was a center of rail and industry, military hospitals, prisoner of war camps, and prisons. Keystone of the local economy was the massive Tredegar Iron Works. Because of its political importance and its economic importance, as well as its location near the United States Capitol, Richmond became the focus for many of the military campaigns in the war's Eastern Theater, and thus the rich environment for my espionage activities. By the end of the war, Richmond had gained the reputation of being one of the most expensive, corrupt, overcrowded, and crime-ridden cities in the Confederacy. Now a little about myself. I was born in Richmond in 1818 to John and Eliza Van Lew, being the first of 3 children. My sister Anna was 2 years younger, and my brother John 5. My parents were originally from the North. My father John was a New Yorker of Dutch heritage, and my mother Eliza came from an old Philadelphia family. She was the daughter of Hilary Baker, one-time mayor of Philadelphia and a Pennsylvania founding father. Grandpa Hilary and his sister Letitia Smith were ardent patriots during the Revolutionary War. So patriotism was in my blood. My parents met in Richmond, married, and were part of Richmond's elite. We lived in a 3.5-story, 14-room mansion located in the 2300 block of Grace Street on prestigious and commanding Church Hill, the highest of Richmond's many hills. We also were across the street from St. John's Church, where Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. The stone used in the mansion's foundation was Scottish limestone, which was brought over as ballast in pre-Revolutionary War ships. The construction of the house was of brick and stucco, and the 3rd floor contained the quarters for the house servants and also storage. My father John purchased the property from Dr. John Adams in 1836. The central hallway measured 18 feet wide and ran the full 80-foot length of the house. My family gave lavish balls and elaborate garden parties, which were attended by the blue bloods of Richmond's high society. Some of our well-known guests were Finnish feminist author Fredrika Bremer. Edgar Allan Poe read his famous poem, The Raven, in one of our parlors. Former President John Adams, Swedish soprano Jenny Lind, Chief Justice John Marshall, and many prominent Whigs also enjoyed our hospitality. Handsome as the mansion was, my father had it remodeled, as did my mother and I, adding a superb 6-column Doric portico, some hidden rooms, and a 2-story piazza on the rear of the house, overlooking the gardens and downward toward the James River, Kanawha Canal, and the business district. The property, with its mansion, several outbuildings, and elaborate gardens, occupied an entire city block. In 1850, my family owned 21 slaves, 14 of whom worked in and around the house and grounds. The remaining 7 worked in our various farms and properties located just outside of town. In those days, slaveholding was a prerequisite for the wielding of power and influence amongst the Southern elite, since your wealth was measured in real estate and slaves. At the age of 12, I was sent to Philadelphia to live with relatives and to be educated in Quaker schools, as had my mother. It was here I first developed my strong feelings regarding the issues of slavery, and the seeds of a future abolitionist were sown. As a young child, I was quiet, introspective, intelligent, possessing an unbending sense of right and wrong. As I matured, I became more stubborn, outspoken, and very independent for the times when Southern women were expected to be quiet, submissive, and dependent creatures. I never married, but my sister and brother did. Guess I was just too darn independent and goal-oriented for any husband. I rebelled against the cult of domesticity required of many women of the time. In 1843, when I turned 25, my father died. Daddy, being a very wealthy man, left us well off financially. He had made his money in the hardware business. As time went by, my mother and I sold off some of our land parcels for cash because our philosophy was cash was king and never, ever be in debt. My mother and I even had the outrageous audacity to sell a couple of land parcels to two free Black women, Mary Ann Ricks and her daughter, Virginia. This created a local uproar and scandal. How dare a Southern woman sell to Blacks, especially Black women? Even though at that particular time, Black women were becoming land and property owners in Richmond. For them, their property would become a stepping stone to greater social stability and mobility, thus angering and threatening many whites. After the death of my father, my mother and I decided to free all of our slaves. We educated those who so desired. We relocated some to the north. And if I heard that some of the children or relatives of my slaves were to be sold by other owners, I bought and liberated them as well. One slave in particular, a mulatto named Mary Jane Richards, AKA Elizabeth Bowser, AKA Ellen Bond, and many other aliases, I sent to Philadelphia to receive an education in order to prepare her to become a missionary and go to Liberia under the auspices of the American Colonization Society, whose mission was pledged to repatriate free Blacks to Africa. Mary Jane was highly intelligent and, most importantly, had a photographic memory. She remained in Liberia for 4 years, then returned to Richmond, ultimately taking a position with my help in the home of Confederate President Jefferson Davis as a household servant under the name of Ellen Bond. Aha, the plot now begins to thicken. In May of 1861, my mother and I turned down local requests to volunteer sewing uniforms, tents, and other supplies for the Confederate troops. Our defiance resulted in personal threats and accusations of treason. We realized our mistake, and to avoid deportation, imprisonment, and even possible execution, we knew we had to begin leading a double life. That of pretending loyalty to the Confederate cause, while in reality, we were definitely working for the Union. We took flowers, reading materials, and baked goods to the Confederate troops mustered at the fairgrounds. And this paid off. Threats, for the moment, ceased. However, after I became involved as volunteering as a nurse for Union prisoners that were wounded, the tensions in Richmond again rose against us. The Richmond Examiner chastised my family in the July 29, 1861 issue. But they didn't name us. However, the newspaper article read, and I quote, "Two ladies, a mother and a daughter, living on Church Hill, have lately attracted public notice by their assiduous attentions to the Yankee prisoners confined in this city. Whilst every true woman in this community has been busy making articles of comfort or necessity for our troops, these two women have been expending their opulent means in aiding and giving comfort to the miscreants who have invaded our sacred soil, bent on raping and murder, the desolation of our homes and sacred places, and the ruin and dishonor of our families. The largest human charity can find ample scope in kindness and attention to our own poor fellows. The Yankee wounded have been put under charge of competent surgeons and provided with good nurses. This is more than they have any right to expect. And of course, the two females cannot be regarded as an evidence of sympathy amounting to an endorsement of the cause and conduct of these Northern vandals," end quote. To legally expose and punish women traitors of the South, the Confederate Congress passed a Sequestration Act in late August of 1861. It enabled Confederate officials to seize property belonging to Unionists and alien enemies, especially women. The passing of the act necessitated my changing of tactics, so my family went underground and began mobilizing a network of spies. And I wrote in my journal the following notation. We have to be watchful and circumspect, wise as serpents and harmless as doves, for truly the lions are seeking to devour us. Sorry, the phone was supposed to be turned off. Oh well. All right. My career as a union agent and crusader against racism was now launched as the drums of war were beating. I became more and more involved in the Richmond Underground, comprised of these Unionists who did not go north. We would meet and make plans for defensive measures for when the war began. We were already involved in providing safe houses or stations for the Underground Railroad. My house was a station, and we assisted in helping runaway slaves go north. And my home became the nerve center for my clandestine activities. The house had a large hidden room in the upper attic, accessible through a sliding door located behind a large bureau. And this area in that uppermost attic of the home could house as many as 50 individuals. In 1862, as the war went on, I became acutely aware of the need for a highly organized intelligence operation in and around Richmond. I was totally committed to the undermining of the Confederate war aims, and thus began my professional life at age 44. Ultimately, I became a spy master. Now, a spy master is the senior operative in charge of a spy network. My duties were to carefully recruit contacts, which I had, among the Richmond elite, the Confederate government, as well as local Unionists and slaves. It was my responsibility to train them in their trade craft. I would receive inquiries and directives from the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, the VMI Chief, Colonel George Sharp, and various military commanders. Then I would deploy my agents and couriers under various covers to obtain the requested information. Once received as spy master, I would sort out, verify, and interpret the information. Then I would prepare my report in code for my couriers to take to Union headquarters 35 miles away at City Point. I always divided my messages into several parts and gave different couriers each a part of the message. And this was done for safety purposes. In case a courier would be intercepted, the entire message would not be revealed to the enemy. The couriers were also unaware of the entire message in case they were captured and tortured. You just can't tell what you don't know. And my job was to constantly seek relevant information to channel to the commanding generals Grant, Butler, McClellan, Meade, and Sharp, plus the Secretary of War and President Lincoln. In recruiting agents and couriers, I strategically selected and placed my agents and couriers amongst the general population of Richmond's Confederates and Unionists to retrieve a wide spectrum of information valuable to the Union cause. I looked for individuals from all walks of life, young and old, rich, poor, black or white, and male or female, and I asked them if to join my spy network after I had thoroughly vetted them. Characteristics that I looked for in these individuals were, first of all, intelligence. They had to have the ability to quickly assess and analyze a situation. Secondly, adaptability. They had to be able to change their looks through the use of disguises and also their cover stories. They had to be a risk taker, not afraid to face the enemy in a dangerous situation. They had to be a quick thinker and resourceful, because it takes guts to be a spy, since you would be killed if you were caught. They had to be confident enough to remain calm while under extreme pressure, and always have a plan B if plan A was not working. Ultimately, I handled over 40 individuals in my spy network. I wanted to have eyes and ears everywhere. And my agents and couriers were selected from the following categories: We'll begin with farmers. Farmers were those who transported foodstuffs to families, prisons, grocery stores, etc. And in delivering, some of these products were hollowed out to contain messages. And at that time, farmers were free to go without any suspicion. Second category were grocers. They had watchful eyes and ears. They would pick up tidbits of information from the patrons who unwittingly divulged information that they had received from letters of loved ones in the Army or Navy. Third category were saloon keepers. Hey, you get them drunk and they'll talk. But it was my job to have to separate out what was bragging and what was fact. Excuse me. Housekeepers, maids, and butlers I also had in my employ because they were generally ignored because they were Black and thought stupid. They would eavesdrop on conversations and read correspondence and documents that the unknowing Confederates would leave out in the open. Another category would be coachmen. They would overhear conversations in the coaches that the carriage occupants thought they were in a safe and out of earshot of others. Bakers and bakeries, here again, would pick up tidbits of information as well as their delivery men. Excuse me. Rail and Navy shipping merchants, very important, because they could report to me any unusual movements of munitions, large orders of food, fodder, lumber, housing materials, etc., indicating a future battle was in the planning. Seamstresses, they would have knowledge of large gatherings with governmental officials, balls, dinner parties, and special meetings. They would carry their messages in their dress patterns and actually in the dresses or fabrics. Slaves, many eyes and ears to hear things of value to the Union. Carpenters, same thing. They would be working in and around homes and businesses, always picking up little tidbits of information. Government clerks and officials, I had penetrated the Confederate Adjutant General's Department, and here I would get information on rebels, regiments, their brigades, divisions, corps, their strengths, where they were stationed, what was the battle plans. And I also had agents in the engineering department who gave me plans of the defenses again around Richmond and Petersburg. As a spymaster, I carefully trained all of my agents and couriers in their tradecraft. Tradecraft being the actual techniques and methods employed as a spy or courier. And I am very proud to say, not one of my messages was ever intercepted during the war. I had developed a 36-box grid cipher containing letters of the alphabet and the numerals 0 to 9. And each letter and number was represented in ciphered messages by its coordinates. And the key I kept in my watch case. And I also used invisible inks and developed code names when I communicated with high-ranking commanders and government officials. I have with me today some samples of my tradecraft. Remembering that the very first and foremost objective was never draw attention to yourself. You were just basically to just melt into the woodwork, so to speak. My people frequently used disguises, and we had secret pockets sewn into clothing. There would be foodstuffs and other items, all containing messages. And my agents were trained to become highly alert at all times, constantly evaluating escape routes if the situation went sour. And some of my tradecraft items were, first of all, the parasol. Southern ladies carried parasols. Looks perfectly innocent, doesn't it? However, in my parasol, when I was going to enter into a prison, I always had the parasol because, you know, we had to protect our skin against the sun. And upon close scrutiny, inside, because these are double lined, inside one of the panels, I would have maps, money, variety of messages that I would dispense to the prisoners. So what you see is not necessarily what you get. All right, another item, tradecraft, would be, I always had a basket. And this basket would be filled with fresh produce, meats, anything that would be of help to the prisoners. Now, the basket itself looks perfectly harmless. Wrong. The basket always had a false bottom to it. And underneath that false bottom, again, money, newspapers, maps, messages, etc. for the prisoners. As I said, I would, because my family owned several farms, we had an ample supply, fresh fruits, vegetables. We had many chickens, so we had eggs. And I would bring, when I would go into the prisons, baskets. And I usually had several of my slaves with me, all carrying baskets. And it looks perfectly innocent. I mean, you have apples, potatoes, and breads. Well, you know, the little loaves of bread look perfectly innocent. However, well, not all, but many of them had a hole in the bottom. I don't know if you can see it. And a message would be inserted in this, and then the plug would be replaced in the loaf. And so it would look all perfectly innocent. Another thing that I would bring to the prisoners would be quilts, various items of clothing. This is just a mock-up of a quilt, and it looks perfectly innocent. However, the prisoners knew nothing I did was really innocent. Some of the squares of a quilt would not be sewn on all four sides. One side would be open. They would reach in the square and again, pull out money. I would have salt, sugar, medicines in the quilt. And it was, again, like I say, I was never ever discovered with my contraband, so to speak. Another item, as I mentioned, we had many chickens. So because I knew that prisoners were deficient in protein, I would bring baskets full of hard-boiled eggs, all looking perfectly innocent. However, if the prisoners, when reaching in a basket, felt an egg that was unusually light in weight, they knew, aha, this is one, if I squeeze it, which this one isn't squeezing, always, a message could be found in the remains. I had other hiding places, of course, in clothing, but I won't go into that because of time constraints. After the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, 1,200 Union officer prisoners began arriving by rail and boat to occupy Libby Prison. Libby was a former tobacco and grocery warehouse. It was adjacent to the Kanawha Canal and James River. I focused my attention on ministering to prisoners by bringing them food, medicines, blankets, and clothing, etc. Ultimately, I spent a great deal of my wealth on these actions. I could see the prison from my home high on Church Hill, which was 6 blocks away as the crow flies. From my vantage point on that piazza, I could look downward toward the prison and monitor all kinds of activity. I would see railroads bringing in additional prisoners, or I would see the railroads loading up and carrying rebel soldiers. I also observed boat activity using the Kanawha Canal. Now, sometimes I had to pose as a harmless, somewhat eccentric Christian old maid when I approached the prison officials in order to gain access to prisoners. I employed the ancient art of flattery, in particular with a very vain General John Winder, who was the provost marshal, and I did this in order to get his permission and paperwork to enter the prisons. You couldn't just walk into a prison. You had to have paperwork saying it's okay for you to enter. Now, with General Winder, I complimented him on his massive head of white hair, and I compared him to the Greek god Janus, and he fell for it hook, line, and sinker. With the first commandant of Libby Prison, David Todd, who incidentally inherited the Todd characteristics of unstable behaviors. And he also was half brother to Mary Todd Lincoln. With David, I always made sure in my baskets that I would be carrying into the prison, I always had freshly baked gingerbread and buttermilk to stay in his favor. Once I got into the prisons, I began setting up my contacts and information gathering. I would seek out certain prisoners whom I knew possessed the kind of information I was seeking. Their names would have been given to me by General Grant or Colonel Sharp. I would also relay letters and messages via the flag of truce boats, excuse me, to the prisoners' families back home. In time, my activities were becoming more and more under suspicion. So, to throw off the scent, I offered temporary housing to Captain George Gibbs and family, the Libby commandant who replaced Todd. And then word spread around Richmond, gee, How can the Van Lew women possibly be carrying on any disloyal activity when they had the Confederate commandant, prison commandant, and his family living right in her home? Sneaky of me, wasn't it? Fortunately for my mother and I, Gibbs' tenure at Libby was short. We were very happy to see him and his noisy, very messy family gone from the premises. I found Union prisoners to be an excellent source of information. At Libby, the prisoners were all officers in the Union Army and Navy, and the non-coms were sent to Belle Isle, Castle Thunder, or other prisons in Richmond. While in transit from their point of capture to the prisons, being trained men, they would closely observe Confederate troop movements, conditions of the troops and animals, supplies, fortification locations and strengths, and they would notice the various flags or guidons to denote specific military units and commanders. Because of the efficiency of the BMI, which was the Bureau of Military Intelligence, under the leadership of George Sharp, the Union was more aware of military units, size, and strengths, and their current commanders than were the Confederates, and this became very evident at Appomattox. All the information I gleaned, I would forward to Union headquarters, all in cipher, of course. Between the Union prisoners, my agents and couriers, I supplied Generals George Sharp, Meade, McClellan, Butler, and Grant, plus Edward Stanton and President Lincoln, with both tactical and strategic intelligence. The tactical intel was for immediate use to the military commanders in the field. This would include information on enemy troop movements, plans of attacks, times of attacks, strengths of attacking troops, and the names of their commanding officers. As the war progressed, knowing who the military commanders were was very important, inasmuch as some of the commanders were deficient in leadership skills and strategy. Many of the commanders had been classmates at West Point, so they were aware of others' strengths and weaknesses. The old adage, know thy enemy, definitely came into play here. Some samples of technical intel I provided to Grant. I warned him that the Confederates were laying 2,000 subterranean shells around Richmond and Petersburg. Plus, they were mining the James River with underwater torpedoes. In today's modern terms, we call them mines. I also notified Grant of the Confederacy's plans to evacuate Richmond, moving the capital to Lynchburg, and also moving POWs to Andersonville, Georgia. Strategic intelligence would be of value for long-range planning at the governmental level. Here, Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln would assess my reports on the Confederate government's planning, status of the troop morale, pending political or military appointments, foreign relations activities, and the degree of their support, since England, France, Italy, Canada, and others were giving support to the Confederacy, but were being asked for more and more by the Confederates. Also, the availability of food and forage for man and beast and arms supplies were important strategic intel to be assessed. All of my agents and couriers I deemed to be very important and valuable to my operation. 4 individuals do stand out as providing me extremely valuable intel and aid. They were Mary Jane Richards, AKA Ellen Bond. Her information gleaned from the home of Jefferson Davis. While performing her chores as a housemaid, she read maps, important documents left on the desks and tables, all the while committing them to memory. Remember, she had a photographic memory. An assistant to Mary Jane was Thomas Nivens, a baker who made daily deliveries to the Davis household. And if Ellen had information for me, she would give it to Tom. Tom then would give it to me, and the reverse would also take place. If I needed to talk to Ellen, I would talk to Tom, he would tell Ellen. Second person of importance was William Jackson. Willie was President Jefferson Davis's personal coachman, and he would be privy to confidential conversations held in what President Davis, military commanders, government officials, and foreign diplomats thought were secure conditions in the coach while Willie drove them around Richmond. Third person was Samuel Ruth, the superintendent of the RF&P Railroad. And Sam would know the troop movements, shipping schedules, and numbers involving various military supplies and their destinations. And Sam was a sneaky devil. He would often deliberately delay bridge and engine repairs and slow down schedules for shipments, which of course drove Robert E. Lee absolutely batty. Fourth person was Erasmus Ross. Erasmus was a married 21-year-old clerk in Union and Libby prison, and he helped in the escape of some prisoners. Erasmus remained in deep cover until well after the war. Just a little side story as to how Erasmus aided prisoners and my intel network. He was the nephew of Franklin Stearns, a rich unionist and a prominent Whig in Richmond, who had used his influence to get Erasmus elected to the clerkship, because that would keep Erasmus out of the Confederate Army. I recruited Erasmus as a deep cover agent. His role was to play the mean jailer who actually was instrumental in helping arrange prison escapes. The word was in Libby, if you were called down to his office, you were never seen nor heard from again, implying that you were killed. Not so in reality. After the war, his identity and role played was not revealed by me to protect him and his family. Another sample situation with Erasmus involved a Lieutenant Colonel William Lounsbury. Erasmus had to call roll at the prison twice a day, at 7 a.m. and then again at 5 p.m. And he would be very mean to Libby officers, frequently striking them, always cursing, And he, in conducting his roll call, he approached Lounsbury, punches him in the stomach, and all the time yelling and cursing, saying, "You goddamn blue-bellied Yankee, I want you to go down to my office now. And you and I have a matter that needs settling." And he had him escorted out by 2 guards. Well, poor Lounsbury was thoroughly confused because he had no idea what had set Erasmus off. And Erasmus continued with the roll call, went down to his office, and Lounsbury was sitting there. 2 guards were outside the door. Erasmus enters and starts yelling and making all kinds of noises at Lounsbury. And of course, the guards who were eavesdropping all thought, poor Lounsbury, he's going to have his, well, all the time this was going on, Erasmus was silently motioning to Lounsbury, "Go behind that counter because there's something there for you." Lounsbury got the message and went behind, and here was a Confederate uniform waiting for him to change into. Erasmus went to the door, opened it slightly, said to the guards, "You are dismissed." Okay, the guards left, and a few minutes later, Erasmus himself walked out of his office. And a little bit later, Lounsbury slowly and carefully walked toward the front door of the prison and exited it, only to be met by a couple of my people waiting outside to guide him to my house and future safety. I was involved in several Libby prison breakouts. I always had people located outside of the prison, ready to meet escapees, to guide them to various safe houses, and then on to safety to Union lines. My youngest agent was 15-year-old Josephine Holmes, a vivacious, pretty Southern belle who would be waiting for a certain escapee from Libby, who was, of course, dressed as a Confederate, courtesy of Erasmus. When the prisoner exited the front door of Libby, she would rush up to him, throw her arms around him, link her arm through his, and slowly stroll up the street. And any onlookers would assume they were lovers and pay no more attention. Again, score 1 for my side. Well, my money and connections kept the lines of communication open from inside the prison to the outside world. In words of Union Colonel David B. Parker, I was, quote, "the guiding spirit," end quote, of the brave men and women, white and black, who made it possible for some Union soldiers to escape the horrors of prison life in Richmond. Another covert operation of mine pertained to what is now called the Ulrich Dahlgren affair. In March of '64, Colonel Dahlgren was a cavalryman and the son of Rear Admiral John Dahlgren, who was a very close friend of Abraham Lincoln. Ulrich and General Hugh Kilpatrick were to raid Richmond, and this was in reality a diversionary tactic. One purpose was to free Richmond prisoners. Ultimately, Dahlgren was killed, and supposedly papers were found on his body that revealed his objective was to capture President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and to burn Richmond. This has never been proved historically. Well, Dahlgren lost his right leg below the knee at Gettysburg. When his body was discovered after the Richmond firefight, the wooden leg had been removed, as well as the little finger on his left hand. His dirty, bloody, partially clad body was displayed at the York River Railroad depot, much to my chagrin. I was outraged by the humiliating action on the part of the Confederacy. I made it a point through my network to find the secret location of his burial, disinter the body, give it an honorable funeral, and eventual reburial on the farm of Robert Orrick with a peach tree planted as a marker. His father, the Admiral in Maryland, was notified that we would return his son's body as soon as it was safe to do so. Unfortunately, this did not occur until after the war in June 1865. Ulrich's missing wooden leg and pinky ring that had belonged to his sister were located through the efforts of my people and also returned to the Admiral. Richmond was taken on April 3rd of 1865 by Union troops under the command of General Godfrey Weissel. I had a 34 star, which you see behind me, Union flag, which I had hidden in my home. And I promised that I would fly from my rooftop when Richmond would be taken by the Union. And this promise I kept. I, with the help of a couple of my agents, went to my rooftop and proudly displayed the flag. In spite of the jeers and threats of bodily harm to me and my family by the Richmond Confederates, I displayed the flag to welcome Union troops and officers as they entered Richmond. Mine was the first Union flag to be unfurled in the Confederate capital. As the flag was unfurled, a howling mob of Richmondites gathered below, shouting, "God damn the old devil, burn her place down." All the while moving forward toward the house, trampling the gardens. All 5'2" of me stepped forth and confronted them, furiously shouting, "I know you, and you, and you. General Grant will be entering Richmond in 1 hour. You do one thing to my home, and all of yours will be burned to the ground." They were convinced and they moved away. Because of the threats I was receiving from the locals, General Grant issued an order for my home to be put under guard at all times. He put General Eli Parker in charge of my safety. Soon afterwards, most of the Union commanders and officials, including General and Mrs. Grant, came to my home for tea and to pay their respects. Grant and Mrs. Grant wrote thanking me for the valuable services I had performed during the war. And I quote in their thank you note, "You have sent me the most valuable information from Richmond during the war," end quote. The Richmondites never did forgive me. And again, I wrote in my journal, "I am held in contempt and scorn by the narrow-minded men and women of my city for my loyalty, socially I am living utterly alone in the city of my birth, and this hurts me deeply. My value to the Union was certified in writing by both Generals Butler and Sharp. And Sharp said, and I quote, "For a long, long time, you represented all that was left of the power of the United States government in the city of Richmond. You sent emissaries to our lines when no one else could, for the moment, be found, using your own servants. You ran through your fortune to help federal prisoners and hired lawyers for Unionists on trial. You had clerks in the rebel war and Navy departments in your confidence. You steadily conveyed intelligence, and yours was the most meritorious case I have known during the war," end quote. These words helped soften the isolation and loneliness that I felt. The disciplined nature of my spycraft, my system of encrypting messages, of deploying couriers with various covers and using bribery to turn enemies into sources enabled me to stay out of the reach of my Confederate pursuers. I had achieved the reputation as the most skilled, innovative, and successful spy for the Union in Richmond. In my career, I made it a point to capitalize on the blindness of Confederate authorities in their unwillingness to believe that a woman of my social standing could possibly be a dangerous Union spy. After the war, I never made public the details of my spy operation in order to protect all my agents and couriers from harassment and reprisals, especially for those still living in the South. Several Northern publishing companies contacted me for my memoirs, but I placed honor above money and refused them. After the war, I continued my abolitionist work and entered the political arena. I supported African American rights and women's suffrage. President Grant made me postmaster of Richmond as a political appointee in March of '69. In my tenure, I modernized the post office. I instituted citywide delivery. I placed mailboxes throughout the city streets. I published a post office manual, which provided the patrons with all kinds of useful information. I positioned myself as a champion of racial equality and took actions to elevate the status of Blacks. I even had the audacity to hire Blacks to work in the post office, therefore striking a blow to the South's racial caste system. Here, the seeds of civil rights movements are sown. With the change of presidential administrations, I lost my job when Rutherford B. Hayes came into office in 1876. My mother died in 1875, and we had not friends enough to be pallbearers. Only those former slaves who chose to remain with me served as her pallbearers. When I freed my slaves, I also hired them as employees. So they received a salary for those that stayed with me. I died of congestive heart failure on September 25th, 1900, at the age of 81. I was alone, except for my cats and Judy Johnson, my mother's maid, who served as my nurse and companion in those later years. Because our family plot in Chaco Cemetery had insufficient room, my casket was placed in the ground vertically instead of horizontally. The Revere family in Boston were very grateful for my part in helping Colonel Paul Joseph Revere of the 20th Massachusetts escape from Libby Prison and make his way safely back to Union lines. The Reveres and other families in the Boston area of men I helped escape sent to Richmond a memorial granite boulder to be placed on my gravesite, and the plaque reads, "She risked everything that is dear to man, friends, fortune, comfort, health, life itself, all for the absorbing desire that slavery be abolished and the Union preserved." I wanted my legacy to proclaim, I wish to be considered a true patriot before, during, and after the war, and not a crazy spy and traitor. In 1993, I was inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame at Fort Huachuca in recognition of my service to the country. Thus ends my story as Union Spymaster in Richmond during the Civil War. It is my hope that you leave today having a greater understanding, knowledge of, and respect for a very courageous and patriotic lady, Elizabeth Van Lew of Richmond, Virginia. I thank you.
Hey, thank you, Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, great job.
thank
Really appreciate it. I know this is Barb's, she's done a lot of presentations, but this is her first Zoom presentation. So I know she's put a lot of work and effort into being able to do it and prepare for it. And I know from personal experience, it's difficult, particularly the first time, to just talk to a camera. They did a really great job in portraying in character Elizabeth Van Lew, and very informative. So again, thank you very much.
John, I know you have a business meeting, so what we can do, if anyone has questions for me, they can email me their questions and I will answer them via email.
Okay. Do you want to get your email out to anybody or not? Do you want to do that, or?
Yes, it's okay.
Go ahead. I don't have it, so go ahead if you want to do that.
It's civilwarbuffbarb@gmail.com.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And